Why do most countries use different train gauges? If you were to build a railway network from scratch, how wide would you make it? Would you adopt the official standard gauge of 1,435 millimeters? Or perhaps you'd like to develop your own width of track, 500 millimeters. If you were just going to build a short one-off track, your choice probably won't matter that much. But if you're planning for the long term, you might want to consider whether you will want to connect to a neighboring country's rail network for trade, or perhaps you don't trust your neighbors and don't want them to be able to use your railway lines. You might be wondering what different types of gauge are currently found around the globe. Well, around 60% of the world uses the standard 1,435 millimeter gauge today. The other 40% use either a narrow gauge or a broad gauge. But the situation gets more complicated. In many countries, there is also a mixture of different gauges. But why? To answer this, we need to take a quick tour through the history of railway tracks. In the early days of rail travel, there was no universal standard for track gauges. Many engineers, private companies, and countries would simply build tracks to their own designs. Often train tracks were built to link neighboring towns together or were designed for private use. Since these tracks didn't need to connect together, there was little need to standardize. After all, when the first ever train tracks were developed by Robert Trevithick and George Stephenson, their choice of width was relatively arbitrary. In the United Kingdom, where railroads were first developed, there were originally two standards: Stephenson's gauge, which was developed in 1825, and Isambard Kingdom Brunel's gauge, which was developed in 1838. For the next 50 years, the two gauges competed in a war of tracks until Brunel's wider gauge lost out to Stephenson's by an Act of Parliament. Brunel's entire Great Western Rail network was soon converted to the new gauge. This made Stephenson's gauge the standard gauge used in the United Kingdom. Many other countries had a similar story, with competing track gauges being laid down until one ultimately won out as networks had the need to integrate. At the time of the Civil War in America, for example, the North used the standard gauge, while the South mainly used a broader 1,524 millimeter 60-inch gauge. As the war progressed, the South quickly adapted their network to match the North's in order to help with their war effort. It is also worth remembering that replacing or regauging track is a pretty expensive affair. For this reason, it is not unusual to find a mixture of gauges in use in countries where converting gauges is not absolutely necessary. In Spain, for example, a broader gauge, called Iberian gauge, won out. But when they started building their high-speed network, the standard gauge was chosen. Interestingly, they also have special trains called Class 130 that can change gauges at low speeds using a special converter. But historically, there were also some interesting strategic reasons for having different railway gauges from neighboring countries, especially potential enemies. For example, Russia famously had a narrower gauge than Germany. This caused a myriad of problems for Germany during World War II, as trains would need to stop and transfer cargo in order to move through either country. This might have just been an accident of history, rather than a planned strategy. Whatever the case, it helped stall the German invasion of Russia. All well and good, but you might be wondering if one gauge is better than the others. As a general rule of thumb, narrow gauge tends to be cheaper to build, since it uses fewer raw materials. It is also more useful for following hill contours, more appropriate for going around sharp corners, and is better for light railways. But this comes at a trade-off. Trains usually need to run slower on narrow gauge, and the narrower cars can carry fewer materials per train. Broader gauges, on the other hand, can carry relatively more materials per car and at higher speeds, up to a point, but these wider gauges are much more expensive to build. To this end, Choosing a gauge involves the weighing up of the pros and cons for a particular environment and budget. To conclude, we can sum up the reasons why different train gauges exist around the world. 1. The original gauge chosen was often a matter of chance or circumstance. 2. Once a gauge was in widespread use in a particular country, there was often no economic benefit to converting to a new gauge. 3. Narrower gauges were often chosen because of geography. 4. Wider gauges work better on flat ground and where a large amount of materials need to be moved by train.